My name is Dr. Evelyn Park, and I used to believe that the dead took their secrets with them when they left this world, that missing people stayed missing, that unanswered questions eventually stopped echoing in empty rooms if you just built enough walls around the silence. I thought that when someone you love vanishes without explanation, the kindest thing to do is learn to live with the void they leave behind, rather than keep digging through soil that holds nothing but disappointment. I was wrong. Some secrets don't die with their keepers. They find other vessels to carry them forward, other voices to speak truths that refuse to stay buried, other ways to surface when the time comes for the lost to finally be found. The desert wind carried a stillness that morning that felt unnatural even by Mojave standards, the kind of silence that made birds pause mid-flight and coyotes disappear into whatever shadows they could find. I wiped the accumulated dust from my windshield as I pulled into the makeshift parking area beside my mobile veterinary clinic, positioned just outside Joshua Tree where the edge of civilization met the vast emptiness that stretched toward Nevada. The schedule was mercifully light that day. Just a few ranch dogs needing vaccinations, and one sick goat whose owner was convinced that fresh air and prayer were better medicine than anything I could provide from my rolling pharmacy. But my mind was elsewhere, caught in the familiar spiral of thoughts that had been consuming me for months. 6 months since my daughter Emma had stopped returning my calls, choosing silence over the kind of difficult conversations that might have repaired the fractures between us. 2 months since my last migraine had been severe enough to leave me unconscious on the clinic floor for nearly an entire day, waking up disoriented and alone with no memory of how I'd ended up there. And 3 days since I'd seen the coyote again, standing at the edge of the road like a sentinel, never crossing but always watching with an intensity that made my skin crawl with undefined dread. The radio crackled at 10:47 a.m., with a voice I didn't recognize, probably one of the ranch hands from the scattered properties that made up my practice territory. The tone was strange, not the usual matter-of-fact communication I was accustomed to from people who dealt with injured animals on a regular basis. There was something reverent in the way he spoke, as if he'd encountered something that demanded respect, rather than simple veterinary intervention. Doc Park. We found one near the old Southern Pacific yard. Dog. Looks like she's been walking for days, but she's dragging her back legs. We tried to get close, but she won't let us near her. Something about the whole situation feels different, not natural. The abandoned railway yard was a 23-minute drive through terrain that grew increasingly desolate with each mile, past rusted mining equipment and collapsed structures that served as monuments to the region's extractive past. When I arrived, I could see why the caller had been unsettled by what he'd found. The dog was positioned near a section of rusted track, her body arranged with an almost ceremonial precision that suggested purpose rather than random collapse. She was a medium-sized mixed breed, probably part German Shepherd based on her bone structure, with a coat that had once been golden, but was now matted with desert sand and stained black with what looked like motor oil from the abandoned machinery that littered the yard. Her front half was alert and proud, head held high despite obvious exhaustion, but her hindquarters told a different story. Her back legs dragged behind her like dead weight, leaving parallel furrows in the sand that traced her journey from wherever she'd started to this lonely place where she'd decided to wait. When I approached slowly with my medical bag, speaking in the gentle tones I'd learned during 15 years of veterinary practice, she growled low in her throat. Not the pain-filled sound of an injured animal, but something deeper and more primal. A warning that seemed to carry undertones of authority, rather than desperation. It wasn't until I stopped moving and whispered, "I'm not here to hurt you, beautiful. I just want to help," that the growling ceased and she allowed me to come closer. Lifting her required careful maneuvering because her back legs didn't hang limp the way I'd expect from paralyzed limbs. Instead, they remained tense and controlled, positioned with a precision that suggested voluntary restraint rather than neurological damage. She cooperated with the transfer to my truck, using her front paws to pull herself into the carrier. But her hindquarters moved with a deliberate stiffness that defied medical explanation. During the drive back to my base clinic in town, I found myself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than necessary, studying this enigmatic patient who'd arrived at the edge of my world like a puzzle wrapped in fur and mystery. There was something about her bearing that triggered memories I couldn't quite access, fragments of knowledge that felt important but remained frustratingly out of reach. Back at the clinic, I administered a mild sedative to make the examination easier for both of us. Standard procedure for unknown animals, especially those showing signs of neurological issues. But as the medication took effect and she relaxed on the examination table, I began to notice details that made my medical training collide with possibilities I'd never considered. Her paws were worn down to the raw flesh in places, evidence of the long journey that had brought her to that railway yard. But when I tested nerve response in her hindquarters, the results were baffling. No reaction to pain stimuli, but clear muscle tension that suggested conscious control. Her legs weren't paralyzed or damaged. They were being held in position by some mechanism I couldn't identify or understand. It wasn't until I began to examine her more closely, parting the matted fur on her hindquarters to check for injuries or surgical scars, that I discovered something that made my hands shake and my breath catch in my throat. Embedded beneath her skin, running from her hip joints to her ankles in perfect symmetrical patterns, were dark grooves that looked like circuitry designed by someone with intimate knowledge of both anatomy and electronics. Not scars from injury, not surgical incisions, but deliberate markings that had been carved into her muscle tissue with precision that spoke of advanced technology and purposes I didn't want to contemplate. The markings weren't just decorative. They pulsed with their own faint light when touched, responding to pressure and electrical stimuli in ways that suggested they were connected to her nervous system at a fundamental level. Under certain angles of illumination, they seemed to form patterns that reminded me of computer processors, of neural pathways, of maps to territories I'd never imagined could be accessed or explored. I stepped back from the examination table, my hand pressed over my mouth, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't natural formations or the result of some bizarre injury. They were intentional modifications, biotechnology that shouldn't exist outside of science fiction, embedded in the body of a dog who'd dragged herself across miles of desert to reach my clinic for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Fragments of a lecture from veterinary school reassembling themselves into coherent knowledge. Dr. Harrison's theoretical seminar on neural memory interface technology, a course that had been quietly dropped from the curriculum after his research funding had mysteriously disappeared. He talked about the possibility of encoding information directly into muscle tissue, of creating biological storage devices that could preserve and transmit data independently of traditional electronic systems. But that had been theoretical, hypothetical, the kind of cutting-edge research that existed only in academic papers and grant proposals. The idea that someone had actually developed and implemented such technology was disturbing enough. The fact that they'd tested it on animals was beyond my ability to process rationally. I named her Sable, though she didn't respond to the name or any other I tried. Over the following days, her behavior became increasingly unusual, following patterns that seemed to have nothing to do with typical canine psychology. Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., she would position herself facing the eastern wall of the clinic and bark 3 times. Always the same cadence, always the same duration. She refused to drink water near any reflective surface, cowering whenever she caught sight of her own image. And she would howl at sounds that seemed to exist beyond the range of human hearing. Her head tilted at angles that suggested she was listening to frequencies I couldn't detect. Driven by scientific curiosity and growing unease, I began documenting everything. The way her pupils dilated in rhythmic patterns that resembled Morse code. The way her body would twitch during REM sleep. Movements so precise they looked like she was inputting coordinates or accessing files. The way she would position herself at specific locations in the clinic, always facing the same direction, as if she were receiving transmissions from some distant source. One evening, working late and unable to sleep, I brought a blacklight to examine the markings on her legs more thoroughly. Under ultraviolet illumination, the patterns became incredibly complex, revealing details that had been invisible under normal lighting. The grooves formed intricate circuits that extended far beyond what I'd initially observed, creating a complete network that seemed to map her entire nervous system. But more disturbing than the technology itself was the growing certainty that I'd seen these patterns before, somewhere in the buried memories of my childhood. My father had been a biomedical engineer, working on classified government projects before his disappearance when I was 16. He'd kept journals filled with sketches and diagrams that had seemed like abstract art to my teenage eyes, but now I was beginning to suspect they'd been blueprints for something far more sinister. Desperate for answers, I contacted Dr. Marcus Chen, a former colleague who'd left conventional veterinary medicine to work in biotechnology research. I sent him photographs of Sable's markings, hoping he could provide some scientific explanation for what I was seeing. His response came within hours and filled me with a dread I hadn't experienced since the day my father vanished. "Where did you find this? Don't let anyone else see these images. Don't publish anything. If the wrong people know you have her, they'll come for both of you." The next morning, the clinic lost power just as I was preparing to examine Sable again. Not unusual in the desert, where equipment failures were common, but the timing felt deliberately orchestrated. In the dim emergency lighting, Sable lay completely motionless, as if the absence of electricity had somehow shut down whatever systems were operating in her body. "Who did this to you?" I whispered, kneeling beside her still form. Her eyes opened immediately, focusing on my face with an intensity that made me feel transparent. Then she did something that shattered the last of my rational skepticism about what was happening. She nudged her nose against the locked drawer of my desk, the one where I kept my father's journal, the one I hadn't opened since moving to the desert 5 years ago. With trembling hands, I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the leather-bound notebook that contained my father's final research notes. I'd avoided reading it for years, afraid of what it might reveal about his disappearance, afraid of learning that the man I'd idolized had been involved in work that violated every ethical principle I'd been taught to respect. The last entry was dated 3 days before he vanished. A detailed sketch of a dog with glowing legs, covered in the same circuitry patterns I'd found on Sable. Beneath the drawing, in my father's careful handwriting, was a single word that made my blood freeze. Testament. Sable crawled to the corner of the room and began pawing at the floor tiles, her movements deliberate and purposeful. Following her lead, I pried up the loose tiles and found a small metal object buried in the concrete beneath. A tag, corroded with age but still legible, inscribed with my father's initials and that same word, testament. The truth hit me like an avalanche of grief and understanding. Sable wasn't a stray who'd wandered into my life by accident. She was a message, a living testament to research that had cost my father his life and his freedom. The markings on her legs weren't just technology. They were memory storage devices, containing information that someone had considered valuable enough to preserve in the most secure biological vault they could create. My father hadn't disappeared. He'd been silenced, eliminated because his work had produced something too dangerous to be allowed to exist in the world. But somehow, this dog had survived, had carried his final message across years and miles to reach the one person who might be able to understand what she represented. As I sat in the darkened clinic, holding my father's tag and staring at this impossible creature who'd brought his memory back to life, Sable did something she hadn't done since I'd found her. She stood up, her hind legs functioning normally for the first time, and walked to where I was sitting. No dragging, no resistance, no sign of the mysterious constraint that had limited her movement. She looked directly into my eyes, and in that moment, I understood that her journey was complete. She'd delivered her testament, fulfilled her purpose, connected me to a truth I'd never known I was searching for. The technology embedded in her body had been designed to preserve my father's research, to ensure that his discoveries couldn't be completely erased by those who feared their implications. But more than that, she'd been programmed with one final mission: to find me, to lead me back to work that needed to be finished, to truths that needed to be told regardless of the consequences. She was my father's final gift, his way of reaching across death and secrecy to remind me that some knowledge is too important to stay buried. The wind howled against the clinic windows, carrying the scent of sage and possibility across the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other in voices that sounded almost like laughter. And in the emergency lighting of my small clinic, a dog who shouldn't exist sat patiently beside me, waiting for me to decide whether I had the courage to honor the testament she'd carried so far and for so long. The past wasn't finished with me yet. There would be people who would want to reclaim this living archive, who would try to silence both of us to protect secrets that should have died decades ago. But as I looked at Sable, seeing my father's determination reflected in her amber eyes, I knew that some truths are worth any risk. Some legacies demand to be preserved regardless of the cost. She had dragged herself across impossible distances to bring me this gift of dangerous knowledge. Now it was my turn to decide what to do with it, how to honor both her sacrifice and my father's memory, how to transform their testament into something that could change the world instead of simply haunting it. The technology that had created her was meant to be a weapon, a tool for storing and retrieving information that could be used to control and manipulate. But love had found a way to repurpose it, to transform a device of oppression into an instrument of revelation. The circuits in her legs didn't just contain data. They contained hope, the possibility that truth could survive any attempt to destroy it. As the night deepened and the emergency power flickered, casting strange shadows on the clinic walls, I began to understand the magnitude of what my father had accomplished. He'd taken their most sophisticated surveillance technology and turned it against them, creating a biological time capsule that could preserve not just information, but intention, not just facts, but purpose. Sable wasn't just carrying my father's research. She was carrying his love, his determination to ensure that the work he'd died protecting would eventually find its way to someone who could complete it. The dragging legs hadn't been a sign of disability. They'd been a form of protection, a way to appear harmless while carrying cargo that could reshape our understanding of consciousness, memory, and the true meaning of technological evolution. The coyote I'd been seeing at the edge of the road hadn't been random wildlife. It had been a scout, a guardian watching over Sable's journey, ensuring she reached her destination safely. The desert itself had been complicit in this reunion, providing cover and concealment for a mission that had been planned before I was born. Now that the transfer was complete, now that the testament had been delivered and accepted, a new phase was beginning. The knowledge my father had died to preserve was no longer hidden in the neural pathways of an exhausted dog. It was alive in my mind, burning with the urgency of secrets that demanded to be shared, truths that refused to stay buried any longer. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my clinic, engines were starting, cars moving through the night, carrying people who'd been waiting for this moment, who'd been monitoring for signs that their lost experiment had finally surfaced. They would come for Sable, and they would come for me, because some knowledge is too dangerous to be allowed to exist in private hands. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that love was weaker than fear, that loyalty could be overcome by intimidation, that the bond between a father and daughter could be severed by time and distance and the threat of consequences. They were about to learn that some connections transcend death, that some missions are too important to be abandoned, and that truth has a way of finding voices to speak it even when all the original speakers have been silenced. Sable stretched and yawned, then settled beside my feet with the satisfied air of a job well done. The dragging was over, the testament delivered, the circle finally complete. But as I looked into her eyes, now bright with intelligence freed from the constraints of her coded mission, I understood that our real work together was just beginning. The past had returned to claim its due, and justice delayed was about to become justice served, carried forward by a woman who'd inherited her father's determination, and a dog who'd proven that some messages are too important to be lost, no matter how far they have to travel or how long they have to wait to find the right person to receive them. The wind continued to howl, but it no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like celebration, like the earth itself approving of secrets finally being brought to light, of truth finally being given the voice it had been waiting for all these years.